Wonderful. So welcome everyone to the first lecture for this summer school series. The lecture is entitled Populism in International Relations, Introducing a Dynamic Research Field. I'm the moderator for this session. My name is Rubrick Biegon. I'm a lecturer at the University of Kent, where I do research mainly on American foreign policy. So my interest in populism and foreign policy is related to the US mostly. So greetings and welcome from Canterbury here in the UK. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this first lecture. Dr. Sandra Destradi is Professor of International Relations at the University of Freiburg in Germany. She's also a long-term guest professor at Reichman University in Israel. She is currently the co-leader of the Populism and Foreign Policy Project, which is funded by the German Research Foundation. Sandra also has research interests in global governance and the global South, as well as research interests in emerging powers and international politics. She's published widely in those areas as well, but she's speaking to us today as a leading expert on populism in international studies. And the lecture provides an introduction to this research field that we're all interested in, looking at the international implications of populism and the global effects of populism. And I can think of no one who is better suited to kick off this summer school program. And with that, I will hand it over to Sandra for her lecture.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Rubrick, for this super kind introduction. And and many thanks for having me in this context. It's a great pleasure and an honor to to kick off this program, which looks super interesting, and you really managed to mobilize all the most active people in the field. So congratulations for this. It looks really like an amazing program. So I'll start sharing my screen, and so here it is. Okay, so and if you have, if something is not clear at some point, if you have any question, please feel free to jump in. I'm not able to see all of you at the same time, so just switch on your mic and say something, or raise your hand, but try to make yourself noticed, and I'm happy to reply to questions in between if something is not clear. And by the way, I find it super interesting and really exciting to have a group that is so diverse, coming from different parts of the world, with an interest in this research agenda, which is developing in a very dynamic way, as you will hear in a second. So exactly what I would like to do today is give you an introduction into how the field has developed, the field of studies that looks at the international dimensions of populism, and that basically asks, what the impact of this phenomenon, which has mostly been studied as a domestic political phenomenon, is on foreign policy, on the foreign policy of single countries, and on international politics more broadly. And you will hear that, this is a dynamic, growing research field, but with, many things having happened over the past few years. But you'll also see there are many questions that are still open, and a lot of research to do, hopefully, for you as a future generation of young scholars, who knows, interested in these issues. I start by saying a few words on different understandings of populism, even though many of you might already know many of them. And after talking about how the field has developed, I will say a few things about how in the project I'm doing together with Johannes Plagemann from the GIGA in Hamburg, we are trying to theorize populist foreign policy, to think about how populism impacts foreign policy change in single countries. And I will give you some empirical insights into one of the fields we're looking at, which is conflict behavior, the question of, are populists escalating international disputes? Are they doing foreign policies that are less, compromise-oriented as compared to those of non-populists? Quite a lot in terms of contents for 45 minutes. So we'll see how far we reached and how much empirical detail we want to have, but we also have the Q&A to complement that. So as you know, I'm sure the phenomenon of populism is not a new one, right? So we hear a lot about populism these days. It's probably more relevant than ever with, Trump being a potential, with a lot of possibility of Trump being reelected in the United States. You've seen what happened, or maybe you heard about the European Parliament elections recently, which saw an incredible rise of especially right-wing populist parties in several countries in Europe. There's been elections in France yesterday with a big success for the right-wing populist Rassemblement National. So it's a highly relevant topic, but it's not a new topic. So you had populism in Latin America very early on. Think of Perón in the 40s. And this is where also first theories of populism originated. So populism actually is one of the few fields of study where, theorizing also started from other world regions, not just from the global north. And particularly there was this interest in populism in Latin America initially. And this is where the first understandings of populism developed, which put a lot of emphasis on the kind of policies populists do, particularly when it comes to economic policies. And so this first understanding of populism is frequently called an economic structuralist approach, a way of theorizing populism basically as irresponsible policies, giving goodies to your, to potential voters, to your supporters. Based on insights from cases like Perón's Argentina, we also have, headlines like Italy's populists agree budget to abolish poverty. You had this reddito di cittadinanza, kind of basic income introduced by the Five-Star Movement when it was part of a government in Italy in 2018-19. So this issue of doing policies that are irresponsible fiscally is frequently, was originally seen as part or as the key component of populism. Interestingly, as far as I know, for example, in some places like India, the debate on populism still very much associates the notion of populism to those irresponsible policies, for example. But this is not how large parts of the discussion in the mainstream kind of political science have moved to recently. One thing that led to further developments in theorizing came again from Latin America, because in the 90s there was a second wave of populism in Latin America where you had a number of leaders that suddenly did something very different in terms of economic policies. It was not about distributing goodies to your potential voters. It was really about following and supporting the neoliberal policies recommended mainly by the IMF. So you had suddenly a neoliberal strand of populism in the 1990s in Latin America that where this economic structuralist definition didn't work anymore. And this is how another understanding of populism emerged that thought of populism more as of a political strategy. And you have work by Kurt Wieland, who basically argues that what defines populism is a peculiar setup of the relationship between the leader and followers, which he considers to be, relationship between a personalistic leader who seeks to exercise government power based on direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized support from large numbers of mostly unorganized followers. So what is emphasized here is this link between the leader and some very unstructured masses, which I think is certainly an important component. But this approach has also been, criticized in recent years because you have cases of populists in power with very well-structured parties. For example, you have the BJP in India, for example, with a very strong organizational structure. There is a strong personalistic leader and there are the masses, but this is not unmediated at all. In other places, think of the Polish government of the peace until recently. There you didn't have a strong charismatic leader and nevertheless a populist government. In recent years, some studies have focused on another aspect of populism. So we're going through different definitions of populism, right? And this other aspect is style. So scholars like Benjamin Moffat emphasized that populism is something that divides society into two groups, the people versus the elite, but that it's also a peculiar way of doing politics, understood really in a stylistic manner. So this is why we see populists in some cases, trying to act as if they were, part of the common people, making back jokes like Berlusconi did in the 90s in Italy, or, think of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines with, frequent abuses, slurs, etc. So using bad manners to show that they are part of the people, close to the people, behaving like the common people on the street. And the stylistic approach also focuses on the fact that populists tend to emphasize or to construct even crises, threats, and to perform these crises in order to generate support among their followers. One more approach in the analysis of populism is a discursive one, and there's a very long tradition to this. I'll not go into details because it's very complex, but for example, Ernesto Laclau, in his work on populism as a discourse, thinks of populism as something like a political logic, which is a very broad understanding that creates dichotomies. It simplifies the political space by pitting basically the people against some power block, which other trends in populism research would rather label the elite. But it's really about creating these dichotomies and filling the people and the elite or the power block with meaning, depending on what kind of populist you are. So populism as a discourse, this kind of approach is more interested in how the people and the elite are discursively constructed by political actors as part of a political project, right? Now let's move on to the approach that I follow in my project, that is like one of the most widespread ones. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best one for every question you ask if you're interested in the international dimensions of populism. So this is not an effort, to proselytize or to claim this is the best way of studying populism. I found it, for the kind of work I'm doing, the most useful approach because it's a very slim definition, a very parsimonious one, but it also looks at how ideas are shared. So it allows you to basically look at what populist leaders do, but also what parties do, but also where the ideas come from. So you could potentially also look at populist attitudes among the public, something we don't do in the project, but is like, I think, another area where a lot of research could be done. So you can see whether ideas about what society should look like are shared by different actors. So this understanding of populism doesn't think of populism as a strategy or a way of doing policy, not as a style, but really as a set of ideas. It's an ideational approach. And more than a set of ideas, really as an ideology, but as a very thin one. So what does it mean? If you think of socialism, for example, socialism is not a thin ideology, it's a thick ideology. It tells you many things about what society should look like, how the economy should work, how different social groups should be related to each other, about equality, production, etc. Right? Populism, if you think of it as a set of ideas, is not a thick ideology because it entails only very, very few elements. And that's the definition developed by Cas Mudde, who's a political scientist based in the US. And he says that populism is an ideology which considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, right? So basically, it's about imagining society as being divided by this fundamental line, the people versus the elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, the general will of the people. So you see there's an inherent belief in democracy in this understanding, but we will see in a very specific understanding of democracy where the leader plays a very important role as embodying the will of the people. But so the idea is really that you have anti-elitism, the fact of being against elites, as a very important component of populism. And the other constitutive component is people-centrism, the idea that the people, you should do politics for the people in the name of the people. And the question then is, who is the people and who is the elite? How do you fill those, those labels, or post-structuralists would say those empty signifiers with meaning? And here, this is where thick ideologies help you. In fact, usually this thin ideology of populism is combined with a thick ideology. So you can have left-wing populists, think of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Evo Morales in Bolivia, for example, who say, okay, the people, they are the oppressed, the working classes, the underdogs worldwide, the victims of capitalism, of US imperialism, that sort of things. And the elites, those are, the capitalist elites, but also the old political elites, and on a global scale, perhaps, the US as a hegemonic power. If you're a right-wing ethno-nationalist populist, with that kind of thick ideology, you define the people and the elite in very different ways. So, for example, Narendra Modi in India, and his BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a Hindu nationalist party, they would define the people mainly as Hindus in India, a religious majority community, and those who don't belong to the people are rather religious minorities, the Muslim minority, but also others. And the elite, that's the old political establishment of the Indian National Congress, those dynastic politicians you had there before, who were so detached from the true people, right? While Narendra Modi as a leader is a self-made man, son of a tea seller, someone who belongs to the people. This is how you can, fill the people and the elite as categories with different meaning, depending on how you combine this thin-centered ideology of populism with a thick ideology. Okay, so what I tried to do up until now, and I can't see all your faces, so I hope there are not too many question marks, in your eyes. What I tried to do was to show that there's not one definition of populism. There have been many. This has developed over time. But nowadays, there still are, competing understandings of populism. This last one, the thin ideology, is the one I'm working with, but you could also apply an understanding of populism as a discourse or as a strategy to focus on some aspects related to the international dimensions of populism, and that would be perfectly fine. You would perhaps look at slightly different things depending on the approach you choose. But in my view, in the end, the expectations we might develop for the international dimensions of populism end up being quite similar, regardless of the approach we choose. So actually, I think, we don't have in our small field that is emerging these big fights about which definition of populism is right or better than the others, which is something I actually enjoy, because we are interested, in what are the effects, and in the in the phenomenon out there, and in making sense of it, and not so much in these conceptual debates. I think as a caveat, and this is also really important, I'm sure when you read the news, you see a lot of talk about populism, and there's an inflation in the use of this concept. So I think we should really be careful in how we use it, regardless of which definition you use in the things you write and when you analyze phenomena. Just, be sure to make clear which definition you use and to stick to it and to be very precise about it. We should be careful, for example, about not confusing authoritarianism with populism. There's some debate about this, but populism, in my view, has this inherent democratic idea of wanting to, express the general will of the people, and populists usually keep doing elections, keep holding elections, and there is this inherent, democratic imperative. Then we know that populists, once they come to power, are very skeptical of anything mediating between them and the people. So they're very skeptical about democratic institutions, checks and balances. And this is why in many cases with populism in power, you see democratic backsliding, right? A weakening of democratic institutions, up to things like, constitutional reforms and changes to a presidential system in Turkey, for example, or more subtle forms of democratic backsliding in places like India with restrictions to press freedom, etc. But you see that populists, there's a tension, believe in democracy, but then once they're in power, end up weakening democratic institutions. Where do we put someone like Putin? There are scholars who argue, okay, Putin's Russia, that's also a case where you have populism in power. I would say no, that's where it actually ends, and that's outright, authoritarianism. But we should, have clear definitions and say why we consider certain cases to fall into which category. We should also be careful, about putting all parties that have extreme political positions on the left, on the right, into the populist box. Populism is really about this people-centrism, anti-elitism. Not every irresponsible fiscal policy is automatically populist, right? And at the same time, and this is something some colleagues also really point to, we should be careful about the risks of kind of normalizing, for example, radical right parties, neo-fascist parties, etc., by labeling them as populist. They also are populist in some cases. But of course, we risk, by putting them in one box with many other parties that don't have these extreme tendencies, to normalize these phenomena, right? To make them perhaps look, less dangerous than they are. So we should be aware, at least, of these dangers. Still, I believe populism as such is a useful analytical category to make sense of a certain group of phenomena, but we should really, be careful about being very precise and clear in saying why we consider certain cases to be populism and others not. Okay, let's move on to how the field of studies on the international dimensions of populism has developed in recent years. So when I started doing this, working on this together with Johannes Plagemann, we were both coming from the study of India's foreign policy. We hadn't done anything on populism up to that point. We were IR, foreign policy analysis people. And listening to discussions of colleagues on populism, we thought, hey, wait, but Modi is a populist. Let's have a look at how this populism of his maybe impacts his foreign policy. And we did what you usually do then. We did a Google Scholar search and looked for populism and foreign policy to see, which theory we might apply for this analysis. And there was basically almost nothing out there at that point in time. So it felt like, okay, did we make a mistake, or did we really discover a real research gap, which is a very rare thing to do? And yeah, so apparently it was not a mistake. There were very few publications out there. There was work by Bertian Freiburg, who will also, I think, speak at the summer school, and his co-author on the Lega Nord, the party in Italy, as a junior populist coalition partner in a coalition, and how that impacted foreign policy. There was work by Angelos Chrysogelos, whom you'll hear right after me, who really shaped the field and wrote one of the very first things on how populism impacts foreign policy. But apart from that, there was nothing at that time. So Johannes and I wrote the very first paper on India, trying to develop first hypotheses and to see, are they plausible for the case of India. And in the meantime, the field has grown incredibly. It has moved in many different directions. You have super interesting work on how populists, use international politics, foreign policy to legitimize their rule domestically, how basically foreign policy is at the service of domestic politics for populists. Work by Daniel Weiner from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, for example. There's been work that has applied approaches from foreign policy analysis to the study of populist leaders. You know that FPA is interested also in individual leaders, so this really is very suitable because we've heard several approaches to populism are interested in this direct, unmediated relationship between leaders and the people. So you have work that basically looks at the personality traits of populists in power or their operational codes. So how do they make decisions? What do they do in foreign policy as individuals, really? There's been work that tries to go beyond the foreign policy dimension and to look at how populists operate within international organizations or how they relate to international courts. So trying to climb a bit also the ladder of abstraction and to ask, what is the impact of populism on international institutions in a broader sense. So far, we don't have like really systematic efforts at theorizing populism and foreign policy, and this is what I'm doing in my project, and you'll hear a bit about that later. In terms of output and where do you find things that have been published, for example, there was really an incredible amount of things going on in recent years in terms of special issue publications in comparative European politics, the British Journal of Politics and International Relations. There's one special issue published by Leslie Wehner from the University of Bath in, I think, a Latin American journal, also with contributions in English, however. There's a forum published under the leadership of Angelos in International Studies Review. And in September, in the new issue of International Affairs, there will be another special issue with, I think, 11 articles on the international effects of populism, edited by Daniel Weiner and me. So there's a lot going on in terms of publications. There are also 3 edited volumes that are definitely worth mentioning. And if you're interested in the topic, do have a look at them. The first one here by Frank Stengel and co-editors was one of the very first attempts to, in book form, bring together contributions on the international dimensions of populism. The volume edited by Daniel Weiner and Phil Jurlando, I'm sorry for taking a not so sharp picture, looks at populism in various world regions, trying to see how in different world regions populists do foreign policy. And then you have this volume here, which looks at populist communication in international politics from a variety of angles. It's also really, really good edited volume. So lots of reading recommendations for you. And maybe also interesting to know that things that will come up, and I need to do some self-promotion here, not so much for a handbook that will come. We are in the process of editing the chapters that come in, and this will be hopefully published next year. We'll see. We'll submit it to the publisher in autumn. But maybe more interesting for some of you, there will be a call for as many as 11 positions for doctoral students coming up very soon, because we secured funding from the European Union for a doctoral network called IdeoPop, the International Dimensions and Effects of Populism. And it's coordinated in Freiburg, so I'm kind of the person in charge for this, and brilliant scholars are involved. So Leslie Wehner from Bath, Christian Lequen from Sciences Po, who's interested in populists and diplomats, Fred Söderbaum from Gothenburg, Fabrizio Coticchia from Genoa in Italy, Pilar Bilgin from Bilkent University in Turkey, and Natasha Cieszynska from Jagiellonian University in Poland, plus a number of think tanks. So, watch this space, like my Twitter account and things, if you're interested in pursuing a PhD in this field, because there will be these job openings sometime probably in October, November also, for PhDs to start in spring 2025. Okay. So now I try to use the not so much remaining time to say a few things about how we are trying to theorize populism and foreign policy, or perhaps populist foreign policy. We're not so sure about that at this point, in a project that I'm doing together with Johannes Plagemann, with funding from the German Research Foundation. And what we do in the project is we ask the question, a basic one in a sense, before trying to think about the broader impact of populism on world politics and what does it mean, like on this more general scale. We start with the more concrete implications of populism, really for the foreign policies of single countries, and we ask how and why the formation of populist governments leads to changes in foreign policy. So the question really is, what happens after populists come to power? Will they disrupt everything like Trump did, right? So will they leave international institutions? Will they start new conflicts, or escalate disputes with other states? Will they be less engaged in global governance? Or will all of this maybe not be so dramatic, because we know from observing the world out there that, in fact, only one country left the European Union, even though you had many other populist governments in Europe. You didn't have an Italexit or Grexit or Polexit, at least not so far, right? And you see populists engaging in global governance. You have someone like Prime Minister Modi, a right-wing populist, who does not deny the importance of climate change, not at all, and has been quite engaged in promoting renewable energies and doing things quite actively in this field of climate change mitigation, for example. So things are apparently more complex. Not all populists do the same things after they come to power. Is there anything they have in common? Is there something like a populist foreign policy? What kind of change do populists bring to the foreign policies of their countries? So this is what we're interested in the project. Now, how do we develop a theory on this? How can we develop expectations about populist foreign policy? So we chose to work with this thin ideology approach, which is really thin in the sense that you just know, okay, populists are anti-elitist and they put the people at the center and claim to speak for the center. So what can we expect based on this when it comes to foreign policy? Well, we expect, and we look at 4 fields. You could expect, in theory, populists to play the Trumpian playbook, in a sense. You could expect them to have foreign policies that are more confrontational, less willing to compromise, because populists see the world in black and white terms. It's all about this, us versus them. They follow a Manichaean logic. There's good versus evil, black versus white, the enemies versus the friends, right? So, and if you claim to speak for the people, to really embody the will of the people, you will also claim that the people are always right. And if the people are always right, how will you compromise in a negotiation? How will you be able to, backtrack perhaps on what you said before? So you could expect populists, for example, for these reasons, to be less willing to compromise in international disputes. You could also expect them to be more egoistic in a way, less willing to contribute to provide global public goods. What are global public goods? Things, contributions like to climate change mitigation, for example. They are, no one can be excluded from global public goods, right? And there's no rivalry in consumption of global public goods. So the point is, global public goods are tricky because there's the phenomenon of free riding, which means everyone benefits from these goods. So why would you pay for them, right? I'm sure many of you heard about the problem of free riding in the provision of global public goods. And when it comes to populists in power, what would you expect? Well, you would expect them to focus on the people, narrowly defined, but to follow that approach that, why should we pay for something that benefits everyone beyond people. We put the people first, America first, and in many other places from Brazil to Italy, you have similar slogans of putting the respective people first. So this is why we expect populists, or we could expect them to be less willing than non-populists to pay for very costly global public goods. When it comes to multilateralism, engagement in international institutions, you could expect populists to also be less willing to engage. Why? Because institutions might be, suspect to them, in any case suspicious, because they intermediate in a way between the populists and the people. Think of European populists who are very skeptical of Brussels as a faraway place where these elites sit, these cosmopolitan technocratic elites that don't have anything to do with the real people, right? According to European populists. So these international institutions with their, cosmopolitan elites, with this standing up, above the state in a sense, they're very suspicious to populists. Populists tend to prefer to put emphasis on popular sovereignty and tend to be very skeptical about, giving away sovereignty to international institutions. This is what we could expect. At the same time, you could expect populists to be more ready in a way than non-populist governments to break with conventions in foreign policy, to break with traditional partnerships in foreign policy. Here again, think of Trump, who wanted to, well, NATO is also, it's also about costs and multilateralism, but, who really caused trouble in a way with NATO and with traditional partners. So you could expect populists to be more willing to engage with maybe fellow populists in other countries, or with authoritarian governments. So that, for example, in Europe, several populists have this very strong sympathy for Putin and Putin's Russia. So this could lead to a reorientation and diversification of international partnerships. I hope you could follow these thoughts and saw how they relate to the notions of people-centrism and anti-elitism. So in writing, we did this in a more extensive way, but I think it's possible to follow the logic. The problem is, as I said before, not all populists are always like more confrontational, more egoistic, more sovereigntist, or more willing to break with conventions in foreign policy and to become friends of just Russia and China. So how do we make sense of the variations we have there, despite these expectations that we have? We think there is something more to look at, and that the changes which we expect don't take place in the same way across the board in all cases. We think that the intensity of foreign policy change after populist comes to power depends on two mechanisms, on two things which are very peculiar of populism. And those two mechanisms are mobilization and personalization. And I'll say a few things about each of them in a second. And what is important is that these two things are really about how foreign policy is made. So we argue, just in a nutshell, to come with our conclusion in a way right now, that there is not such a thing like populist foreign policy in the sense that they all do the same, that there's the same outcome, that they're all more protectionist or all more isolationist. No, but we do believe, and we actually find that populists have commonalities in terms of how they make foreign policy, of the process of foreign policy making. There are things they have in common, and these things are the mobilization and the personalization dimension, and even though they can also change in intensity. At the same time, important caveats, as we know from the field of foreign policy analysis in general, these are things we look at, we look at domestic dynamics, ideas, etc., and how this shapes foreign policy, but states don't do foreign policy in a vacuum, right? So there are structural factors that matter. So if you are a small landlocked country in South America like Bolivia, your room to maneuver is very different as compared to, I don't know, if you're the maybe only remaining superpower like the US. So maybe this is why we saw more foreign policy change under the Trump administration in the US than in many cases where countries, are deeply embedded in international organizations like in Europe, or just face very severe constraints in their ability to change things in foreign policy. Let's look at the two mechanisms now, and I think, Rubrick, I have like 5 minutes left or something. Yeah, okay. So mobilization and personalization. So mobilization, I think, is fundamentally important if we want to understand how populists do foreign policy, because something very weird happens after populists come to power. They basically become the elite. They become the governing elite they were mobilizing against before. So during the election campaign, they were against the establishment, against the elite. And now they are basically, they have become the elite. So they need to find new ways to mobilize support. And this also explains why populists then are kind of permanently on the campaign trail, even after having been voted to power. So they try to keep mobilizing, and they do so by using also foreign policy issues. Foreign policy is very helpful to mobilize support because you can, use those binaries. You can put the true people against some external other, and you can use thin and thick ideology to generate support talking about foreign policy issues. There's excellent work, by the way, by David Cadier, recent work on how populists politicized foreign policy and different strategies they use. So I would say what is really peculiar of populist foreign policy is the very strong link between the domestic and the international, between domestic politics and foreign policy, with the prevalence of the logic of the domestic. So foreign policy tends to become, a tool to actually keep mobilizing at home, to gain support at home. And populists bring foreign policy issues to the domestic debate, right? Why does it matter for change? We believe it matters a lot for change, because if you politicize issues, if people suddenly start to care about issues because you politicize them, you bring them into the debate, then you will also need to live up to that discourse, to those promises, in order to remain credible. So if you mobilize a lot against some external enemy or competitor, you will need to follow up on that. And if there's a crisis, to show that you're really, tough in dealing with that competitor or enemy, right? So that's one of the consequences. If you use foreign policy to mobilize support domestically, you might end up, being forced to change, to promote more radical change in foreign policy. The second dimension that is, I think, peculiar of how populists do foreign policy is personalization. So we all know that it's not only populists. We know that you have, the G7 summits, the G20 summits. You have heads of government, playing a very visible role in international politics over the past few decades. It was different, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago. Right? So foreign policy was more technical matter, relegated to foreign ministries, etc. So you have leaders becoming more active everywhere, but. And I'm sorry for the background noises, but my son came back from kindergarten. This is the beauty of teaching on Zoom. I hope it's not too bad. So you have populist leaders basically, claiming to embody the popular will. There's wonderful work by Nadia Urbinati, who's a political theorist, who says that, what is typical of populist representation of their understanding of democracy is this idea that the leader not just speaks for the people, but even is the people. So you have phenomena like examples like Narendra Modi speaking on the Red Fort in Delhi on India's Independence Day, saying, "I am the voice of 1.4 billion countrymen." And you really see the populist leader claiming to embody the people. Right. So this very peculiar notion of representation that is typical of populism leads to, we believe, an even stronger personalization of decision-making in many fields, including in foreign policy. And this is usually, accompanied by other phenomena, namely by centralization of decision-making. So populists will tend to marginalize foreign ministries, to marginalize elites that have been, traditionally been making foreign policy. And they will also marginalize advisors, established think tanks. So all those actors that stand for continuity in foreign policy. They will also be, less willing to have processes of consultation with, societal actors. It will all be more focused on the leader and on a small circle of advisors. And we find quite consistently evidence for this. Why do we think it impacts foreign policy? We believe that leaders who are not so much constrained and restrained by bureaucracies, by foreign ministries, by experts, by people who give them professional advice, they will end up being more unpredictable. And they might be, the room to have dramatic change or more, a stronger change in foreign policy is just bigger. So to conclude, this is our theory, basically in a nutshell as an overview. When do we expect foreign policy change to be strongest under populist governments? If populists are both strongly personalizing decision-making and if they use a foreign policy issue very strongly for mobilization, right? So this is when the leader will be not so much constrained by the bureaucracy, will be able to break with the past to show that he's doing things differently from previous elites, and will also be able to mobilize support around an issue along the lines of thin and thick ideology. This will depend a lot on how interested people are in an issue, how salient an issue was even before the populist government came to power, but this can be further, increased via mobilization. We expect change, but not so strong, more moderate foreign policy change if one of the two dimensions is strong, but the other not. So if, for example, the leader is not so much constrained by the bureaucratic apparatus, but is quite constrained by the bureaucratic apparatus, but is not really able, no, the other way around, is not really able to use an issue for mobilization, maybe because it doesn't fit with a thick ideology, for example, right? So there are issues where, I don't know, left-wing populists, the thick ideology doesn't give them necessarily tools to mobilize against climate change mitigation, for example, right? And then you have cases where you don't have all that foreign policy change. You rather have continuity if both personalization and mobilization are weak. Okay. So I think in order to keep things, manageable time-wise, and now I'm also seeing your faces and a few question marks in your eyes, but hopefully not too many. I think I should probably stop here. So just to sum it up, we had various understandings of populism, right? Without a dogmatic prescription, but with this ideational approach being the one we chose in the project. We had an overview of how the field developed and this proposal about what a theory of populist foreign policy could look like, or at least how ours looks like. And we emphasized those more procedural dimensions of foreign policy making as something that really kind of mediates the impact of populism. So if both personalization and mobilization is strong, then we will see this less compromising attitude, the decreased readiness to contribute to global public goods and multilateralism, and this diversification play out most explicitly, right? If both are not so strong, which can happen, you rather see continuity, and this helps us make sense of the differences. And now I'll stop here. And
thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you for that excellent, very comprehensive and insightful overview. I think there's a lot to consider, a lot to discuss. I think we're probably running a few minutes behind schedule. So I believe at this stage we move into group discussion, but I'll hand it back over to Aziz and Sheamus for guidance on what happens next.